open God's Word this morning, and I texted Pastor Brian, and I said, what have you been preaching on? What are you going to be preaching on? What's, it's kind of like if you consume pizza all the time, you're going to lack nutrients. I said, what are the things that you're not preaching to these people about that I can come in one time? And he said he's going from a New Testament series into a New Testament series. So he said, why don't you get something out of the Old Testament? And so, lucky me, I get to go dig in the Old Testament for something. And so I went to the book of Jeremiah, and so we're going to look at the book of Jeremiah together today. I don't know when the last time you looked at the book of Jeremiah on your own was. Sometimes it can be a little bit of a maddening book. It's super, super long, and Jeremiah is just an interesting character. We're going to talk more about him this morning. But I want to start with a story. I was sitting in my office this past Friday, so 2 days ago, and in walks this really good-looking young guy. And he walks in, just, that swagger that those good-looking, I don't know anything about the swagger that good-looking young guys have, but good-looking young guys have a little bit of a swagger to them. And he walks into my office and he says, "Hey, are you Pastor Mark?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Hey, I was told about you. I know you work with the homeless." And I said, "Yeah, we work with the homeless." And he said, "Hey, I've got this ministry that God's called me to." And I said, "Okay, so tell me about it." He's like, "Well, I want to partner with you. I want to be able to come here, and I want to be able to preach at the veterans." And I said, "You want to preach at the veterans?" And he said, "Yeah, I want to preach at the veterans. I want to tell them how sinful they are and how they need Jesus, and then I'm going to move on to the next place." He said, and I said, "Okay, is that all you do, or is there other stuff that you do?" "No, I preach, and I leave. And then I go to the army bases, and I preach there, and then I leave. And then I go find more veterans in other towns, and I preach, and I leave." And so I was really nice to him. I think I said something very kind, as I recall in my head, as the story plays in my head, I said something very kind. But inside my head, what I wanted to say was, "Boy, you walked into a Reformed church. That is not how we play." So there's something in common that your church and my church have in common, okay? There's not very many things, to be perfectly honest, that your church and my church have in common, okay? My church is a little different, and I would love it if you're ever in Austin to come down and visit. We would love to have you guys. We'd love to host you. And if I ever have people come this way, I always tell them to come and visit you guys as well. But our church is very, very different. But one thing that we share is that we share a commitment to the same theology. We share a commitment to looking at the Bible the same way. And that way is called Calvinism. And some of you are well-versed in Calvinism. Some of you are maybe hearing about it for the first time. But what Calvinism basically says is Calvinism says in the whole world of Christianity, there's like two ways of seeing salvation. There's about half of the Christian world sees salvation as something that we choose, and there's about half of the Christian world that sees salvation as something that God chooses. And we as Calvinists, we as Reformed people, are solidly on the side that says that God chooses us. That God, before you were even born, before you were created, He chose you. He set you apart for salvation. And as you know, if you've studied this for a long time, there's lots of little rabbit trails and all sorts of other little pieces to this, but that's really the core. And you also know, if you've been a Calvinist for a while, that this whole way of thinking doesn't play super well in Texas. So there are very few places in the world where people dislike being told that their destiny has been decided for them more than America and more than Texas. After all, when we established our independence from Mexico, that was the proudest day as Texas that we have ever had in our entire history. And we only existed as a country for 7 years, but they are the proudest 7 years that Texans could have ever had, because we did it, and we were in charge, and we controlled our own destiny. Now, of course, we went broke, and we had to join the United States. But those 7 years were glorious. They were glorious. Americans are kind of the same way. We did the same thing with the Boston Tea Party, and we fought back against England, and we won our independence. What's important is that we decided our destiny. So to come in here and say, "Hey, Calvinism says you didn't really decide your own destiny, at least in terms of salvation," is kind of an unpopular thing. I think it's why Reformed churches are so few and far between in Texas. They don't really mesh with the culture super well. But I think that it's biblical, and we're going to look in Jeremiah today to see what that looks like. Jeremiah, starting right at the beginning of the book, we're just going to read the first chapter. And if you haven't read this book, or maybe Jeremiah for you, like the only verse you know out of Jeremiah is that verse where Jeremiah says, I know the plans I have for you, the plans to prosper you, the plans to, you know that verse. That's the verse that everybody knows out of Jeremiah, but there's a lot more to the book of Jeremiah than that. So here we go. Chapter 1, verse 1, book of Jeremiah. If you've got the Pew Bibles, which I have, it's page 612. The words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, one of the priests of Anathoth in the territory of Benjamin. The word of the Lord came to him in the 13th year of the reign of King Josiah of Ammon, king of Judah, and through the reign of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, down to the 5th month in the 11th year of Zedekiah, son of Josiah, king of Judah, when the people of Jerusalem went to exile. So what that's saying is he was the prophet, the main prophet, as the kingdom of Judah closed. If you remember, the kingdom of Judah, kingdom of Israel goes into exile much sooner, but the kingdom of Judah goes into exile much farther after that. But he is the prophet that is in charge when Judah actually goes into exile. He is there when they finally close the last door in Jerusalem and the people of Judah are shipped out. The call of Jeremiah. The word of the Lord came to me, Jeremiah, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart, and I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Alas, sovereign Lord, I said, I do not know how to speak. I am too young. Does that remind you of anybody? Doesn't know how to speak? Moses? The exact same phrase that Moses uses when God calls him to speak. Jeremiah uses that same phrase. I don't know how to speak. I can't be the guy. One of the things that you should know about Jeremiah is that he is kind of a Debbie Downer. He's a little bit, kind of complainy. He doesn't always have a smile on his face. You know that some people have like a resting smile face, and some people just like you look at them and they're just sitting there and they just have a frown for whatever reason. That's just the way that they are. Jeremiah would be the frown guy. He's not a smiler. And I think that's also what makes him a good Calvinist. Okay, here we go. But the Lord said to me, do not say I am too young. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and I will rescue you, declares the Lord. Then the Lord reached out his hand and touched my mouth and said to me, I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I will appoint you over the nations and the kingdoms to uproot and to tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. The word of the Lord came to me. What do you see, Jeremiah? I see a branch of an almond tree, he replied, or almond tree, depending on where you're from. The Lord said to me, you have seen correctly, for I am watching to see that my word is fulfilled. The word of the Lord came to me again. What do you see? I see a pot that is boiling, I answered. It is tilting towards us from the north. The Lord said to me, from the north disaster will be poured out on all who live in your land. I'm about to summon all the peoples of the northern kingdoms, declares the Lord. The kings will come and set up their thrones. In the entrance of the gates of Jerusalem, they will come against her surrounding walls and against all of the towns of Judah. I will pronounce my judgments on my people because of their wickedness in forsaking me, in burning incense to other gods, and in worshiping what their hands have made. Get yourself ready, Jeremiah. Stand up and say to them whatever I command you. Do not be terrified by them, or I will terrify you before them. Today I have made you a fortified city, an iron pillar, and a bronze wall to stand against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, its officials, its priests, and the people of the land. They will fight against you, but they will not overcome you, for I am with you, and I will rescue you, declares the Lord. Now, what's going on in the book of Jeremiah, as I said, is that Jeremiah is this story of how God finally has it with his people. He's been kind of playing with them for a while because they have been walking away from him, and then he's been bringing them back, and then they walk away, and he brings them back. If you've read the Old Testament, it's just a constant cycle of them walking away, him bringing them back, them walking away, him bringing them back. And all of the prophets and all of the kings and all of the characters in the Old Testament are all part of this story where they're either walking away from God or coming back to God, or walking away from God or coming back to God. It almost like lulls you to sleep because it's just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth throughout the whole Old Testament. But what happens in the book of Jeremiah towards the end of Judah, which is God's real chosen country, Israel was part of his chosen land, but when they split into two, Judah was really where his heart was. That was where Jerusalem was. That's where David was. He loved Judah. The last two tribes of Judah, he loved them. But even Judah got too much for God to put up with. History tells us that at the very end of the Judah kingdom, they were starting to do things that were even worse than they had done before. Because in the past, they had built themselves idols. As you read in that passage, that they would build themselves idols, and then they would worship the idol. And what a silly thing to do, right? Build yourself an idol, and then after it's built, fall down and worship it. I mean, we kind of do the same thing, but it's kind of nonsensical. But then they took it a step farther. One of the most difficult things in the Old Testament was that there was cultures all around Israel that would do the most detestable thing in the world to God, and that is sacrifice their own children. And what the record says is that at the end of the book of Judah, even the people of Judah were starting to sacrifice their own children to these other gods. And God finally said, enough. Enough. And when he says enough, that means that he's going to allow all of these countries that probably should have overtaken Judah a long time ago to come on and do their business and take Judah off to exile. And Jeremiah is the one that gets to deliver the message. And it's not fun to be the guy who delivers the message that everything around you is going to fall apart. I used to be a chaplain in a hospital, and the worst job is walking into a room after someone has received terrible news from a doctor, that their injuries or their illnesses are going to be terminal, or that their family member has died in a car accident, and you have to walk in and you have to be the one who tells them. That's a terrible, terrible situation to be in. It's reality, it's the truth, but it's not any easier to tell it just because it's the truth. And so Jeremiah is stuck with having to tell the nation of Judah all of these things that are these bad things that are going to happen to them. And because he does what God tells him to do, he is afflicted his entire life. And as I said, he's not exactly the most chipper guy to start with. In fact, he wrote a whole book in the Old Testament called Lamentations, which in plain English would just be like a book of complaining. Okay? He wrote an entire book of the Old Testament complaining. That's Jeremiah. He's somebody who has this like kind of rough demeanor on life, but then also experiences all these terrible, terrible things. Some of the things that he experienced, well, he was thrown in a cistern. He was thrown in a cistern, into a muddy cistern, and he just kind of slowly sunk into the mud. And the idea was that no one would come there to give him food, and eventually he would just die. They put him in the stocks. You know what the stocks are? It's like those wooden things where you put your hands through and your head through, and they put him in public. The king put him in public in the stocks, and he just sat there in the stocks and was a public humiliation. There was a plot to end his life. There was a plot of priests and leaders of the nation of Judah that wanted to kill him. The only way he got away from that was because God told him in a dream that it was coming. And then maybe the most frustrating is that there was a second prophet while he was the prophet that kept saying the opposite thing that he would say. So Jeremiah would go around, he'd go to a town, he'd say, here's what's going to happen. And they would be like, oh no, that's terrible. We should definitely try and change our ways. But then this other prophet would come in behind him and be like, hey, you know what he told you? Never mind all that. You guys are great. Now, which one do you think they believed? The second guy. So everywhere Jeremiah went, a second prophet went and like covered up all the things he said and offered them a better, easier deal. That's the best thing ever. And so Jeremiah was just this frustrated character. He was somebody who found himself in this terrible place. And so every day Jeremiah woke up was probably worse than the day before it. Every day Jeremiah woke up, he's like, my job is to tell people things they don't want to hear. I might get killed for it. Even if I don't get killed, I'm going to have to suffer for it. And all the while, I'm having to do this because God made me do it. I don't know what Jeremiah's prayers to God were like, but I can guess. There were a lot of complaints, a lot of frustration, a lot of anger. Maybe you've had prayers like that to God too, where it's a season in your life where nothing seems to make sense, nothing's going right, and you just cry out to God and say, God, what are you doing here? That's where Jeremiah finds himself. He's constantly running into walls. But in this opening chapter, God tells Jeremiah exactly what he's going to experience. So it's not like he's going in without an idea. God tells him, you are going to be the one that delivers this message. In the very first chapter, while he's being called, he talks about the destruction of Judah. He talks about the kind of messages that Jeremiah is going to have to put out there. But he also says, you will not be hurt. He says at the end of this, they will fight against you, but they will not overcome you, for I am with you, and I will rescue you. Now that's great. It's probably a little frustrating if you've already been told that, all of those bad things are going to happen to you. It's kind of like your consolation bronze medal prize here. But God promises to watch out for him. God promises to care for him. Now, I call Jeremiah the original Calvinist, and I called him that because I think that there's part of Jeremiah that is in this place where he is following the path faithfully that God has put there for him. And there's an acknowledgement from Jeremiah that he was chosen before the beginning of the world to do this. So if you look with me back in verse 5, it says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Jeremiah didn't become a prophet when he was able to speak. He didn't become a prophet when he graduated seminary. He didn't become a prophet when he was able. He became a prophet before he was even conceived. And for those of us who have an understanding of how God works that takes into account the fact that God knows before we're born who is going to be called to what, this is some pretty clear evidence of that. This is some pretty clear evidence that God saw you, God knew you, God was working on you even before you had the chance to opt in, even before you made a decision at church camp. God knew you, he knew he was going to call you, and he had a spot for you in his kingdom. Now, that might sound nice. It might sound terrible, depending on who you are. So some of us, when we think about that, are like, yes, God chose me before the beginning of time. But other people are like, oh man, I got called to this thing, and I got put in this place. And it's a difficult life for me to live. Not everybody gets to live in a lifestyle where they have a place to live, and they have a family that loves them, and they have a situation that is set up for them to succeed. There's a lot of people who enter this world to a much more frustrating circumstance. But what we don't understand about this passage is how Jeremiah is being used in the broader kingdom. And I think that's what we oftentimes fail to think about our own stories too. Like, you ever stop to think about how your story, how your individual story fits into the broader story of what God's doing in the world right now? Your story is an important story. Your job, your calling is an important calling. We just finished up a series at our church last week on identity, about where we receive our identity and our placement in this world from. And of course, we receive that from God. He calls us to things. And that isn't the kind of thing where God's just moving us around as pawns. It's not like predetermined like that. But he does put us in situations. He does open doors to us. He does give us gifts by his Holy Spirit for us to be able to use. And he says, go into these places and use the things that I've given you. Go and be faithful in the callings that I've given you. And for some people, that might mean being a pastor or being a prophet. But for other people, that might mean being a great farmer or being a great custodian or being a great teacher. Whatever job and place God has given you, I think what Reformed theology always says is it is your job to be faithful in the calling in which you have received. You don't have to be faithful in the calling that someone else has received. Not everybody needs to be a pastor. Can you imagine how terrible of a world the world would be if everyone was a pastor? That would be a terrible world. I hang out with pastors all the time. We don't want that. Okay? Brian's the exception. Everybody else? Here's the thing. We as God's people are all called to live faithfully within the worlds that we find ourselves. We as God's people are all called to live faithfully within what God has set out for us. And that's the real story of the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah was, somebody who was called into being faithful in a situation that wasn't very nice. And so I think one of the most important things about understanding what it means to follow God as a Calvinist, as somebody who views Scripture through the lens of understanding the world as God's place of calling and God's call for faithfulness, is that sometimes our callings stink. Like sometimes what we do and sometimes the things that we are called to do are not fun. If you're a parent and you've ever had to discipline your kids, that's not fun. That's not fun. Nobody wants to do it. You don't wake up in the morning and be like, hey, I'd really like to discipline my kids today and have a really hard, difficult talk. Or you don't want to confront your Christian brother or sister about a sin that you see in their lives. You don't want to do it. You don't wake up in the morning and say, ooh, today would be a great day for a confrontation. And yet we're called to do that as brothers and sisters. We're called to live and speak truth into each other's lives. We're called to parent our children and to administer discipline in a way that is faithful in our calling as parents. All of us have pieces of our calling that are not glamorous. All of us have pieces of our calling that are not fun. And yet we as God's people are called into those. And it's okay to lament or complain, sometimes within reason, about the fact that our things that we are called to are not all great. Heck, Jeremiah spent 2 whole books doing it, okay? And if Jeremiah can do that, I'll give you like 1 book, okay? I think sometimes in my own life, some of the things I get called to, I'm like, God, what are you doing? Don't you understand that if I just had $1,000 more, I could do this? Don't you understand if we could get this person connected to this thing, that the entire world would change? And sometimes I think about when he's hearing my ideas, he's like, that's funny that you think that. Right? Because he's got a much bigger plan. He's got a much bigger goal in mind than anything I've got. But in my mind and from my vantage point, there's always like one more thing that God could do for me, and then that would solve everything. But what happens is when that doesn't happen, that's when the real meat of my calling comes into play. When things don't work out or things don't happen the way that I want them to, that's where my opportunity for faithfulness really arises. And if you've been doing the Christian life, if you've been living the Christian life for a very long time, then you know that faithfulness is one of those things that is very, very difficult to do for a long period of time. Faithfulness is sometimes the most difficult thing because it's not readily recognized by your friends. It's not something that wins you awards. It's not something that makes you a lot of money. But it is something that God calls us to. Faithfulness in the little things and faithfulness in the big things. In the way that you tip your waitress, in the way that you return money when somebody drops it on the ground, in the way that you do your taxes, in the way that you administer discipline to your children, in the way that you speak to one another in love and in truth, in the way that you decide whether you're going to show up to church or fake an illness. We as people always have questions of faith. I know you're not faking illness, you're here, it's all right. But we always have that question, right? Of like, what is faithfulness? How am I faithful or not faithful in this situation? And sometimes it's glamorous, but most times it's not. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we as God's people always have a God who has the best in mind. That when we follow after God, and we see it here in the book of Jeremiah, that God says to Jeremiah, I am about to ask you, and we don't know when this happened. Maybe he was 13, maybe he was 25. We don't know when Jeremiah's calling was. But what we do know about Jeremiah's calling is that God laid out a pretty grim pattern of faithfulness for Jeremiah, that some difficult things that he would have to engage in, some hard things that he would have to say, some things that might maybe get him killed or might get him tortured and did get him persecuted. But he also says, I've got you. I care for you. I will have your back. And that's the promise we have from our God when we are faithful to what he has called us to. That it is not always that we are going to succeed whenever we follow God's way. In fact, sometimes when we are faithful, it actually costs us money, time, friendships, whatever. When we are faithful, many times it costs us, but we can be assured that God has our back. And that doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to vindicate you. Now, wouldn't it be nice if, every time that you had to confront someone and then they said, I'm out of here, and they leave and they don't want to hear what you have to say, that God would smack them with something and then show them that they were wrong, and they would come back and ask for apologize to you? That almost never happens to me. I'm still waiting on the time when I get to confront somebody and they'll be like, you were exactly right. That phrase gets said to me very little. Maybe it gets said to you very little too. But that doesn't mean that it's the wrong thing to do. We as God's people can be assured that God has our back if we are living in a way that is faithful to him and faithful to the calling in which we have received. And by the way, that even doesn't mean that he will keep you alive. In Jeremiah's sense, in Jeremiah's case, it did mean that he would keep him alive. But if you think about the apostles, 11 of the 12 apostles were martyred for their faith. They were people who met their death because they were being faithful. There are people all around the world. I saw that you guys were taking an offering for the persecuted church. There are people all around the world that are being asked the question, are you willing to die for your faith? And so it's not always even that God will protect your life. He might not always keep you healthy. Sometimes God having your back means something much more than whether you live or die or whether you have a comfortable life. Sometimes God having your back means that he is in your corner and he will meet you with the compassion and the strength that you need. And so we can be assured as people who are called and as people who live in faithfulness to our calling that God will meet us and God will have our backs. But to me, the most important thing about calling is this. And this is what I want to leave you with to think about today. When God calls us, and we believe that God calls us before we are even born, that before you were even formed, that God had an idea of your calling, an idea of what faithfulness looked like for you. And if that's the case, then that is an incredibly powerful thing to have on your side. I have a lot of friends, some of them, many of them Texans, who disagree with me on the whole Calvinism thing. They're really convinced that you choose your salvation. You choose where you're going. And what they believe is that you personally have the opportunity to open and close your relationship with God. You personally have the ability to open and close your ability to grow with God. And the thing is, if that's your perspective on life, that everything in your life revolves around keeping you in God's good graces over and over and over again, which I actually find to be kind of exciting. I'm kind of jealous that I don't get to baptize people over and over and over again because they left God, they came back, they left God, they came back. I would love to do that. It would really up my baptism numbers at my church. Probably up the baptism numbers at this church too. But because we don't believe in that, what it does is it saves us a lot of energy. Do you know the amount of energy that it takes to constantly keep checking yourself to seeing if you're right with God? When I came to my church, Sunrise, which is a Christian Reformed church like here, People were wondering why we didn't do altar calls. And I see you guys don't have altars up here either. Why don't you do altar calls? Why aren't you calling people up every week to come and make themselves right with God? And of course, our response is, we are not the ones who make ourselves right with God. Prayer is important, and laying before God the things that are going on in our life is important, but we are not the ones who make ourselves right with God. And if we are not the ones who make ourselves right with God, and we don't constantly have to be worrying about making ourselves right with God, what that does is it opens up tons of opportunity for us to do other things. That if you are assured of your salvation, if you are assured that God has called you, then you have the ability to do something much bigger than you could if you were constantly worried about how you stood with him. It's kind of like, I describe marriage like this. Like, if you have a really good partner, if you have a great husband or wife, isn't it amazing how much more you can do with your life with a really faithful partner than you did when you were single? You ever think about that? Like, when you're single, one of these things you're constantly thinking about is, are they going to leave me? Are they going to leave? And now some people who are in marriages have this, so I'm not trying to make light of that. But I'm talking about those of you who have really solid husbands or wives, and you've been married for a long time, and you're pretty sure, maybe it's because you're just stubborn Dutch people, but whatever, they are not leaving, okay? And when you know that they're not leaving, maybe just out of spite, I don't know, but you know they're not leaving, that's an incredibly empowering thing. Because you don't constantly have to be worried about what they're doing. You don't constantly have to be checking their phone or wondering about where they are, and they didn't come home 10 minutes, they came home 10 minutes later than they thought. So you don't have to be worried about all of those things. When you have a partner who is faithful, it empowers you. And that's the thing about Reformed theology, that's the thing about being Calvinist that people don't get, is like, if you're not a Calvinist, what you do is you end up worrying all the time. Is God mad at me? Is he mad at me? Like, did I do something to make him mad? Do I need to get baptized again? Do I need to come? There's all that back and forth. Folks, that has been taken care of for you. You don't have to worry about that. God has called you. God has made a plan for you, and he has welcomed you to live your life. And what you really get as a gift from God then is freedom. Freedom. Because if we are God's people and we are called and the price has been paid, then what you have, and if you read through Paul, this is what Paul's talking about nonstop in the New Testament. He is saying over and over again, folks, people in the Old Testament were constantly trying to live up to these 10 laws. They were constantly trying to make themselves right with God. You don't have to do that. Go live free. Go do things. Go be things for the kingdom. Go get your hands dirty. Don't worry about the mistakes. Get out there and do something. And you only get the power to do that when God has already paid the price, when God has already set you free. The thing about free people is that free people are dangerous people. And I don't mean bad, kind of weird, dangerous. I don't want you to be the kind of people who, buy a whole bunch of billboards and write negative sayings on them, or go online and just say everything that you want to every politician that you can on Twitter. What I really mean is that you, as someone who has been set free by God, is someone who is capable of dangerous things for the kingdom. If you go back through history, the people that have done the most amazing things for the kingdom of God are people that were 100% sure that God was on their side and that God had redeemed them and that God had set them free. One of my learnings, some of you know our congregation's journey over the last few years, was that we started with a congregation that was, kind of blue-collary, but our congregation has increasingly added a whole bunch of people that might be from situations that many people would be considered dangerous. People that come out of prostitution, people that come out of the drug culture, drug dealers and drug users. People who come out of gangs or criminal backgrounds. People who are involved in things that sometimes when they tell me their stories, I have to stop my jaw from dropping a lot, because they tell me stories and I'm like, I cannot believe that that's a real thing that someone experienced. And because we're involved with those people, we get connected to a lot of really seedy individuals. I know a lot of drug dealers personally that are dangerous. I know some pimps that are dangerous. I know people that carry guns and carry knives. Not usually to church. I try not to allow that to happen. But I know some dangerous people. And if you would have asked me 5 years ago, would you be comfortable pastoring those people? I would have said no. I think in order for our church and for me to come to a realization that this is really the kingdom of God, you have to be comfortable at least a little bit with the price. You have to be comfortable a little bit with seeing safety and being like, you know what? There are people who God has allowed to do ministry in safe places. We are going to do ministry with some unsafe people. And the reason that we can do that is not because we are so great. I think it's because we're Calvinists. Because we know God has our back, because we know that he called us before the creation of the world, and he has given us the strength that we need to change things. And if that costs us, then it costs us. But we as God's people are going to walk forward in the strength and the power of what he has done for us. Sometimes we all have those Jeremiah experiences. Sometimes we have those situations where we would love to be the guy who gets to pastor the cool church. I always thought I would be the guy that got to pastor the cool church. I thought I would have this like really slick band, the cool lights. The lights are dark in the sanctuary, and everybody who's walking in is just like, double income and just walking in, and they look like Californians. You know what I'm talking about. And this church is just packed out with these cool people and 1.2 children, and they're probably driving Mercedes. I don't know, but like some person out there gets to pastor that church, and I don't. It's kind of, I feel like Jeremiah is like, I wish I was the guy coming after me who could give these guys all a message they wanted to hear. I get to be the guy who goes in and tells them a message they don't want to hear. Why in God's green earth did he decide that guy got to be the one who said good things and I got to be the one who said bad things? I don't know. It's frustrating. And sometimes our callings can be frustrating. Sometimes our callings can be dangerous. Sometimes our callings can be frustrating. But if we are to be faithful, if we are to live in a way that is dangerous for the kingdom, if we are to take risks, intelligent, God-fearing risks in this world, then we will be better at doing that if we have an understanding of what God has done for us, of what God has called us to, and about the way that God has called us to walk. If we know that he has our back, and we know that even though the call might be difficult, even though the situation might not be ideal, that we have an opportunity to walk into those things with God defending us and with us having all of the tools that we need. A God who loves us, a God who has sacrificed for us, a God who knew before the creation of the world that you had a call that was important to this world. That he knew you, that he loved you, that he has empowered you, and that he has given you a chance to be a dangerous agent in God's kingdom. And so, I only get to come here like once every 4 years. So I just like to ask you, Stephenville CRC, like what are some of those things that God might be calling you guys to in this community? What are some of the things in this community that it's just seemed a little too costly? I'm not talking about money, although maybe it's money, but I find that money is the least of the problems when you really get your hands dirty. What are the things that God is calling you to as a church that might be out of the box? Who are the people in this town that no one wants to love? Where are the places that you have an opportunity that only you as a church have an opportunity to open some doors and to speak to people in a way that they haven't been spoken to by the other churches in the city? Who is God calling you to reach? It might be uncomfortable. It might be dangerous. It might be frustrating. It might be expensive. But you have a God at your back. You have a God who has called you. You have an assurance of your calling that empowers you to do unbelievable and amazing things for the kingdom. And when I say unbelievable and amazing, that might just mean cleaning someone's house or helping someone across the street or financially supporting something good. But if God has called you, don't be scared to walk into that calling. If God has set something in front of you that is a good thing for you to participate in, be ready. Say those words that Samuel said in the Old Testament, "Here I am. Use me." We, God's people, have a calling in our lives. Let's hear it, let's respond, and let's go forward with no fear.